In the late hours of November 17, 1978, a small town in Indiana, Fairview, was about to experience something no one could have imagined, something that would leave the community in disbelief and the local authorities in a race against time. It was a typical Friday night at the Quick Burger restaurant, just a few blocks off Main Street. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, the smell of grease and fryers filled the air. Four teenagers finishing their shifts had no way of knowing that within hours their lives would be over. Their disappearance setting off one of the most puzzling investigations this town had ever seen. Daniel Rivers, Amy Rivers, Jamie Tran, and Mark Bell were all employees working their usual shift. It was their last shift together, a routine ending to what should have been a typical evening. The clock ticked past 11 p.m. The closing checklist began: cleaning, counting the drawer, and locking up for the night. By 11:15, the last customer had left. The doors were locked. The closed sign flipped, and the staff began their final tasks until they were gone. The next morning, when the morning crew arrived at 7:30 a.m., the lights were on, the restaurant was still locked from the inside, and no one was there. The only sign of a struggle was an empty cash register, the drawer carefully pulled out. It was as if they had simply vanished. Police arrived on the scene shortly after the morning staff found the restaurant untouched. Nothing appeared to be missing except the four teenagers. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, no obvious trace, just an empty restaurant. The authorities at first suspected a robbery gone wrong. The money from the cash register was gone. The safe had been emptied, but there were no signs of violence, no blood, nothing to suggest a typical crime scene. The case quickly grew more complicated than anyone could have anticipated. The initial hours after their disappearance were spent searching. Neighbors, volunteers, and law enforcement combed the area. The town of Fairview, a quiet, peaceful place, quickly realized something far more sinister was unfolding. For days, the case seemed to follow the same pattern. Leads going nowhere. The teens had disappeared, seemingly without a trace. The only clue? A faint suggestion that the night had not been as quiet as it seemed. 3 days passed before a breakthrough came. A discovery made not by the authorities but by an unsuspecting farmer, Vernon Layton. While clearing brush on his property, about 20 miles south of Fairview, Layton stumbled upon an unsettling sight: 4 bodies scattered in the woods. They were found in Sycamore Woods, a remote and quiet part of the county. The bodies were positioned strangely, as if left deliberately. Amy Rivers, Daniel Rivers, Jamie Tran, and Mark Bell. 4 teens, each with a different cause of death. But all of them shared one thing in common: they had been murdered. Amy was found first, lying on her back, her arms folded across her chest, as if someone had carefully placed her there. A stab wound to the heart. Daniel Rivers lay nearby, his body beaten, his jaw shattered as if he had been struck repeatedly. His death was a brutal one, and the method suggested something deeply personal. Jamie Tran was found face down, a gunshot wound to the back of his head, a clear execution. Mark Bell, the eldest of the group, was the final victim, a knife embedded deep in his throat, almost as if the killer had wanted to make a statement. The method of murder was varied, brutal yet calculated. The victims had been left in the woods as if discarded, but there was an unmistakable sense of deliberation. The bodies were staged, their deaths arranged with cold precision. There was no way to deny it. This was not a random act. This was personal. Law enforcement arrived at the scene shortly after the discovery. The bodies were quickly identified, and the case shifted dramatically. What had seemed like a straightforward robbery gone wrong now looked like something more complex. There were no signs of struggle or resistance at the Quick Burger, but there was no question now these 4 teenagers were murdered, and the town of Fairview had just been thrust into a terrifying mystery. What followed was the beginning of a deeper investigation. But the questions had already started. Why these kids? Why the brutality? And who would want to leave such a clear message? As the days turned into weeks, more questions emerged. Theories ran rampant through the town. Some believed it was a random act of violence, perhaps a gang passing through, or a robbery gone horribly wrong. Others speculated that the killer was someone local, someone who knew the victims, someone who had been watching. The case was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. With the bodies discovered, the investigation took a new turn. The initial theory of a random crime was quickly ruled out, but the case was far from clear. The next puzzle piece was hidden in the one place that could have offered critical clues: the security footage from Quick Burger. Quick Burger, like many fast food chains of the time, had a basic security system. A single black and white camera that recorded footage of the back office. A simple setup for a small-town restaurant, but in a case like this, it could have been invaluable. The manager of Quick Burger, Greg Hall, had assured authorities that the tape was intact when he had left the building the night before. But by the time Detective Clyde Harrow and his team arrived to retrieve the footage, something was wrong. The tape was missing. According to Harrow's initial report, the camera had been left on, the light was still blinking, indicating the system had been working as expected. But the recording was gone, wiped clean. Harrow immediately pressed Hall for answers, but the manager's story was inconsistent. Hall claimed the tape had been accidentally overwritten. A routine error, nothing unusual, but Harrow knew something didn't add up. In small towns like Fairview, everyone knows everyone. There was no history of technical issues at Quick Burger. The store had not had a tape erased or overwritten for months. And given the gravity of the situation, it didn't seem plausible that the footage had been erased by accident. This left Harrow with more questions than answers. Why had the footage been erased so soon after the police had arrived? Could it have been a deliberate act? And if so, who would benefit from such a loss? The missing tape became an enigma within the case, a key piece of evidence that had simply vanished. And the more Harrow dug, the more the situation began to feel like a cover-up. As the investigation stalled, various theories began to surface. Some of the townspeople suggested that the footage had been erased to protect someone in town. A local with ties to the victims, perhaps, or even someone with a vested interest in keeping the investigation from progressing. Other theories were more speculative. Some residents believed that the killer had been aware of the security system and had deliberately sabotaged it. Maybe the killer had been in the restaurant, watching, waiting for the perfect opportunity to act. Harrow himself wasn't so sure. He believed the tape had been erased by someone who was aware of how vital it was to the case. Someone who knew exactly what the footage could have shown. The more Harrow spoke to witnesses, the more strange coincidences began to surface. A former employee of Quick Burger claimed to have seen a man loitering around the restaurant just hours before the teens were last seen. But the description was vague, and the man was never identified. Meanwhile, another lead pointed to a potential robbery. But if the teens had been the intended victims of a theft gone wrong, why had they been murdered so violently? And why the secrecy around the missing footage? There was also the matter of the restaurant manager, Greg Hall. Some believed he knew more than he was letting on. Was he involved? Or had he simply been swept up in something much darker? Weeks passed and the investigation continued, but the disappearance of the footage left law enforcement at a dead end. Theories shifted, as did the focus of the investigation. No one could answer the simplest of questions. Who would want to erase the evidence, and why? In the small town of Fairview, where everyone was known by name, the idea that someone local might be involved became more and more plausible. But as the months dragged on, it became clear that the missing footage wasn't the only piece of evidence to disappear. Other crucial pieces of evidence began to go missing as well. Witness statements were altered, and some key pieces of physical evidence were misplaced. It wasn't enough to point to a cover-up, but it was enough to raise eyebrows. Was someone trying to make sure the case didn't progress? And then, in an ironic twist, Harrow received a tip from an anonymous source. A phone call, cryptic and unsettling. The caller claimed to have information about the missing footage and more. The message was simple: look deeper, and you might find what you're looking for. With this new lead, Detective Harrow was left with only one question: who was behind this web of deceit, and what were they trying to hide? As the investigation into the missing tape stretched into months, the townspeople began to grow restless. Speculation ran rampant. Was there a cover-up, a local conspiracy? And if so, what was the motive? Was someone protecting a killer? Or was there something even darker lurking just beneath the surface of this small town? But as the case grew colder, so did the town's resolve. The Quickburger murders remained unsolved, the missing tape a haunting symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Harrow, despite his best efforts, couldn't move forward without the evidence he needed. What happened in the dark of that small-town restaurant remained a mystery, one that Fairview would never forget, and the missing footage. It would never be found. As the investigation continued, the town of Fairview began to fracture. The loss of 4 young lives and the apparent erasure of vital evidence set the stage for deep suspicion. But as the case grew colder, something else began to happen. The town's silence became deafening. In small towns like Fairview, people talk. Everyone knows everyone else's business. But after the Quickburger murders, something changed. The conversation slowed. Neighbors stopped asking questions. The air grew heavy with uncertainty. The questions no one was willing to ask piled up, and the town seemed to retreat inward. The families of the victims were among the first to notice. Where there had once been condolences and offers of help, now there was only distance. Townspeople were no longer so quick to offer support. Former friends of the victims suddenly found reasons to avoid the families, retreating into their homes where they were safe from the questions that loomed over Fairview. For the victims' families, the pain was compounded by the town's reluctance to engage. Amy Rivers' parents, Greg and Margaret, were devastated, but they were also angry. Angry at the police, angry at the town, and more than anything, angry at the silence that surrounded them. They couldn't understand why the investigation had slowed down, why it seemed like no one wanted to talk about it. For Daniel Rivers' parents, their grief was tangled with confusion. They couldn't shake the feeling that someone somewhere knew something, that someone in town might have been involved. But no one would speak up. No one would say a word. The silence was suffocating. The silence grew louder as the weeks stretched into months. Locals began to notice strange things. Individuals who had been seen around the Quickburger before the murders seemed to vanish from town altogether. A few suspicious cars were seen late at night, parked near the restaurant. But whenever anyone tried to dig deeper, the leads went cold. The silence was like a wall. Detective Harrow, despite his tireless efforts, found that the townspeople were increasingly hesitant to cooperate. The one thing he had learned over the past several months was this: if someone knew something, they weren't talking. There were whispers, rumors, but nothing concrete. One such rumor, quietly spoken in the corner booths of Fairview's diners, suggested that the murders were tied to something more dangerous, something involving a local business, maybe even a family with power in the town. But no one was brave enough to speak plainly. Some claimed that the town's wealthiest family, the Whitakers, had been involved. The Whitakers had always held sway in Fairview, with ties to local government, law enforcement, and business. Could they have been involved in some way? Had they tried to cover up something? Perhaps they had a hand in silencing the investigation? Others pointed to the local drug trade, which had quietly taken root in Fairview in recent years. Was this some sort of gang-related retribution? But again, these were just rumors, hearsay that lacked evidence. Harrow had nothing to go on. All he had were the same facts: 4 teenagers dead, their bodies dumped in the woods, and a security tape that was mysteriously erased. He had no answers. He had no suspects. And worse, he had a town that had gone quiet, not with grief, but with fear. But even in the quietest of towns, secrets can't stay buried forever. Months after the murders, a new lead emerged, this time from an unexpected source. A young woman named Laura Hartwell, a former Quickburger employee, came forward with information that seemed to shake the investigation to its core. Laura claimed she had seen something the night the teens disappeared. It was the night of the murders, just before closing time. Laura had worked the day shift and was getting off around 10 p.m. As she left the back door, she noticed a car parked in the alley behind Quickburger. It wasn't unusual to see cars parked behind the restaurant. The alley was often used by delivery trucks and late-night customers. But Laura said this car stood out. It was a black sedan with tinted windows. She thought nothing of it at the time, but when she later saw the news about the murders, something clicked. According to Laura, she had seen the car leave the alley just as she was walking out. It wasn't a deliverer's truck or a familiar local car. It was something out of place, something that didn't belong in Fairview. This piece of information seemed minor, but it was enough to spark a new wave of investigation. Harrow immediately ordered a search for any black sedans that could have been in the area that night. There were no immediate results, but it added to the growing sense that this was no random act. The killer, whoever they were, was careful, methodical. As the investigation progressed, the rift between the families of the victims and the town deepened. The families, desperate for answers, began to lose patience. The longer the investigation dragged on without results, the more the town seemed to withdraw. The town itself had become divided. There were those who believed the case would never be solved. They had accepted it as one of those dark, tragic events that simply slipped through the cracks. Others, however, were determined to keep asking questions, refusing to let the murders be swept under the rug. But the most troubling aspect of the case remained: the silence. No one wanted to talk, no one wanted to speak out. In a town that had always prided itself on its close-knit nature, the atmosphere had changed. It felt like the townspeople were hiding something, and that something was more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The Quickburger murders, as they would come to be known, had left the town of Fairview scarred. As the investigation continued to stall, the families of the victims were left with only one certainty: they would never get the answers they deserved. The killer or killers were still out there, and the town had closed its doors on the truth. But Detective Harrow was not ready to let go. Even as the investigation faltered, he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were still hidden somewhere in Fairview, buried beneath layers of silence, lies, and fear. And the killer? They were still out there, watching, waiting. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation into the murders of the 4 teenagers seemed to lose steam. But there was something the people of Fairview didn't understand. While the town had chosen to bury its head in the sand, Detective Clyde Harrow refused to let go of the case. Harrow's frustration grew as the investigation began to reveal deeper, darker layers. Pieces of the puzzle didn't fit. Evidence had vanished. Witnesses had gone silent. But still, Harrow felt like the truth was within reach, buried beneath the surface of this quiet town. And that truth, he suspected, was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The more Harrow dug into the history of the Quickburger restaurant and the surrounding community, the more unsettling connections began to emerge. Fairview wasn't as small and simple as it seemed on the surface. Beneath the quiet streets, behind the town's friendly facades, something was brewing, something that had been festering for years. Harrow began to piece together a story that no one wanted to hear. It was a story of money, power, and influence. And at the heart of it was the Whitaker family. The Whitakers were old money in Fairview. Their wealth stretched back decades. They were the owners of multiple businesses in town, including the Quickburger chain. They were the town's unofficial royalty, with influence that reached into every aspect of local life, from politics to law enforcement to the economy. It wasn't unusual to hear the name Whitaker whispered in town. The family's wealth gave them the power to shape Fairview in their image, and most people respected that power. But in the wake of the murders, some began to wonder, could the Whitakers have been involved in some way? Harrow began to investigate the Whitaker family's ties to Quickburger. He found a trail of unusual financial transactions, payments made to obscure entities and shell companies linked to the Whitakers. Some of these payments were made shortly before the murders. It didn't take long for Harrow to uncover something even more alarming. The Whitakers had been involved in shady business dealings, including illegal activities that many of the town's residents had turned a blind eye to. These dealings went back years, long before the Quickburger murders. Could the murders have been an act of retaliation? Had someone gotten in the way of the Whitakers' empire? Or worse, had the Whitakers been involved in orchestrating the killings themselves to silence those who threatened their power? The more Harrow uncovered, the more the town of Fairview began to look like a powder keg, ready to explode. The real breakthrough came when Harrow discovered that the Whitakers had hired a security firm with connections to organized crime. It was a detail that had never been widely known. The firm, based in a nearby city, had a reputation for handling situations quietly, a reputation built on bribery, intimidation, and sometimes more permanent measures. Harrow's investigation revealed that one of the employees of the security firm had been in town the night of the murders. A man named Mark Duvall. He had a criminal record, and his ties to the Whitakers raised more than a few red flags. Duval had been seen near Quickburger the night the teens went missing. And even more disturbingly, records showed he had been at the scene of other incidents involving the Whitakers' business operations. Harrow suspected that Duval had been sent to cover up something. But what? What exactly was he trying to protect? And why was he so determined to erase any trace of what had happened that night? Harrow's investigation began to center on Duval. The more he looked into the man's background, the more it became clear that Duval was a cog in a much larger machine. Someone who had been used to take care of business when the Whitakers needed to protect their interests. The most chilling part of this discovery was the timeline. Duval had been in the area not just the night of the murders, but also in the days leading up to it. Harrow could feel the web tightening. He was starting to believe that this wasn't just a random crime or even a botched robbery. This was something far more calculated. When Harrow finally tracked down Mark Duval, he wasn't surprised by the man's silence. Duval was tight-lipped, refusing to cooperate with law enforcement. But Harrow had his ways. The detective pressured Duval with questions about his involvement with the Whitakers and the night of the murders. Duval maintained his innocence, claiming he had nothing to do with the killings. But there was one thing he couldn't explain: his presence near the restaurant that night. Nor could he explain why his security firm had been hired by the Whitakers in the first place. Duval's evasiveness only fueled Harrow's suspicions. But Duval wasn't the only one who knew something. Harrow began to learn of a network of people who had turned a blind eye to the Whitakers' operations. Some had been paid to keep quiet. Others had simply feared the consequences of speaking out. The closer Harrow got to the truth, the more dangerous his investigation became. As he uncovered more evidence, he started to realize that he was not just dealing with a murder case. He was uncovering a long-standing conspiracy that had its roots deep in the town's fabric. The most unsettling part of this discovery was how much the Whitakers' influence had reached. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. The Whitakers had their hands in everything, from the local police force to the town's elected officials. Harrow began to suspect that they had been using their power to manipulate the investigation, pulling strings to keep the truth hidden. But Harrow wasn't backing down. He was determined to expose the Whitakers for what they were. He had uncovered enough to know that they were not just wealthy business owners. They were also the puppet masters of Fairview, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, the Whitakers seemed untouchable. Harrow's investigation was reaching its climax, but every step forward seemed to be met with resistance. The question was no longer if the Whitakers were involved, but how far their reach extended. Was the truth going to be buried forever? Or would someone somewhere finally be brave enough to expose the hidden hand behind the murders? Fairview was teetering on the edge. The Whitakers had maintained control for years, but Harrow's pursuit of the truth had ignited something in the town. The silence that had once dominated the streets began to crack. People who had been afraid to speak out were now questioning everything. No one knew what would happen next. Would Harrow's persistence break the town's stranglehold of silence? Or would the Whitakers use their power to bury the truth, just as they had buried so many secrets before? It was becoming clear that there were far more pieces to the puzzle than anyone had realized. As Detective Clyde Harrow dug deeper into the tangled mess that was the Fairview murders, he found himself confronted by a darker, more twisted reality than he ever expected. The Whitakers weren't just a wealthy family with influence. They were at the heart of a massive web of deceit and corruption, one that stretched back decades. Harrow had uncovered damning evidence, but every time he thought he was getting closer to the truth, the investigation seemed to hit another wall. And this time, the resistance wasn't just from the Whitakers. It was coming from within the town itself. As the investigation intensified, Harrow received an unexpected call. It was from someone he never thought would reach out: Mayor Judith Caldwell. The mayor, long a supporter of the Whitaker family, had maintained a neutral stance throughout the investigation, despite growing public pressure. But now, Caldwell had something to say. Caldwell's voice on the other end of the line was shaky, her tone laced with urgency. She began by expressing concern over the direction the investigation was heading. Her words were cautious, careful, but beneath the surface, Harrow could hear the fear in her voice. "Detective," she began, "you need to understand something. Fairview has always been a small town. We don't have the luxury of rocking the boat too much. People like the Whitakers, they've built this town. They've given us funding, stability, And when you start digging into their affairs, well, it makes people nervous. Harrow listened carefully, sensing that this was the beginning of something big. He had long suspected that the town's loyalty to the Whitakers ran deeper than simple admiration. There was fear involved too. Caldwell wasn't just warning him, she was trying to tell him something, but Caldwell continued, her voice trembling. You're not the first to ask questions, detective. There are things that have been buried for a long time, and if you keep pushing, you may uncover things that go far beyond these murders. I'm not just talking about the Whitakers, I'm talking about everyone in this town. The mayor's words sent a chill down Harrow's spine. He was already neck-deep in a case that seemed to get darker by the day. But now Caldwell was hinting at something far more widespread. Something that could destroy everything. Caldwell hung up abruptly, leaving Harrow alone with his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mayor's warning was more than just a vague threat. There was something in her words. Something that suggested this town's history wasn't as innocent as it appeared. Was the Whitaker family really the sole power behind the murders? Or was there a larger conspiracy at play? Determined to find out, Harrow turned to the town's records. He dug through decades of documents, city council meetings, business contracts, police reports. And what he found was startling. A long history of shady dealings, cover-ups, and uncomfortable truths. It was as if the entire town had been built on a foundation of lies. As Harrow sifted through the files, one name kept popping up: Edward Turner. He was a former businessman in Fairview, someone who had once been part of the town's elite, with deep ties to both the Whitakers and the local government. Turner had vanished from the town's records years ago, but his disappearance seemed far from ordinary. According to some reports, he had been involved in several dubious financial deals with the Whitakers, all of which had been mysteriously erased from the public record. Harrow suspected that Turner's disappearance might have been more than just an old business transaction gone wrong. It could have been a cover-up. Harrow's search for Turner led him to an old, forgotten warehouse on the outskirts of Fairview. It was a place that hadn't seen any real use in years. The building's windows were boarded up, the doors rusted shut. It had all the markings of a place that had been abandoned or intentionally hidden. With nothing but the moonlight to guide him, Harrow made his way inside. The warehouse was eerily quiet, filled only with dust and the faint smell of mildew. But in the back, he found something that made his heart race: a stack of old files, abandoned and untouched. And among them was one particularly interesting document. It was a ledger, a list of names, dates, and amounts. And at the top of the page was the name Edward Turner. The ledger detailed a series of large sums of money that had been funneled through various channels, including several anonymous accounts linked to the Whitakers. But as Harrow examined the ledger closer, it became clear that the money wasn't just about business, it was about power. And the people on this list had been manipulated, coerced, and, in some cases, silenced. Harrow realized with growing horror that this wasn't just about the Quickburger murders. This was about something far more sinister. Turner had been involved in an underground network that was far bigger than the Whitakers alone. And when someone crossed the line, when they became a liability, they were eliminated. Just like the 4 teenagers, Harrow's mind raced as he pieced together what he had discovered. The Whitakers had been using their power to manipulate the town for years, ensuring that their influence remained untouchable. The Quickburger murders were only the latest in a long line of sacrifices made to protect their empire. But now Harrow knew the truth. The murders hadn't been a random act of violence, they had been a warning, a message sent to anyone who threatened to expose the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of Fairview. Harrow was closing in on the culprits, but the clock was ticking. The Whitakers would suffer but nothing to keep their hold on Fairview. And as the detective prepared to confront them, he knew one thing for sure: the town would never be the same again. The lies were about to come to light, and someone would have to pay the price. Clyde Harrow was no stranger to danger. As a detective, he had faced down criminals, conspiracies, and secrets that people would kill him to protect. But this was something else. Fairview wasn't just hiding a murder, it was hiding a legacy of corruption, lies, and power so deeply entrenched that it threatened to destroy the town itself. Harrow had discovered more than he ever wanted to know. The Whitakers weren't just responsible for the murders of the 4 teenagers. They had orchestrated countless other disappearances, cover-ups, and illegal operations. And now, the truth was about to come to light. But with the truth came danger. The Whitakers were aware of Harrow's investigation, and as his search for the truth brought him closer to the heart of the conspiracy, he knew that the clock was ticking down. Someone would have to stop him. But who? Harrow's breakthrough came when he received a tip from an unexpected source. An anonymous letter slipped under his door late one night. The letter contained a single sentence: "Meet me at the old town hall at midnight." There was no signature, no indication of who sent it. But Harrow knew it was his chance, his one opportunity to confront the Whitakers and bring everything into the light. He drove to the old town hall in the dead of night, his heart racing. The building, once the seat of Fairview's local government, was now abandoned, its windows boarded up and its halls eerily silent. As he entered, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. The door creaked open and Harrow stepped inside. There, standing in the center of the darkened room, was a familiar figure, Mayor Judith Caldwell. "Detective Harrow," she said, her voice cold and hard, "you've come a long way to uncover the truth. But you should know, sometimes the truth is better left buried." Caldwell's eyes were steely, but there was a flicker of something else beneath the surface. Fear, perhaps. She wasn't just a bystander in this story, she was a player. It was then that Harrow realized the full extent of what had been going on. Caldwell wasn't just a politician trying to protect the Whitakers. She was a key part of the conspiracy. She had been working alongside the Whitakers for years, covering up the crimes they'd committed. Not just the murders, but everything. From embezzlement to bribery to the illegal dealings that had kept the town under their thumb. "You've uncovered a lot, Detective," Caldwell continued, her voice gaining confidence. "But you don't know everything. You don't know who's been pulling the strings, who really holds the power in this town." Harrow's heart sank as the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just the Whitakers. It was the entire town, a network of people all working together to protect their secrets. Caldwell's words rang in his ears as she explained the full scope of the conspiracy. The Whitakers had used their wealth and influence to manipulate every aspect of Fairview's government. They controlled the police, the local businesses, and even the judges. No one was safe, not from the Whitakers' reach. And the murders of the 4 teenagers, they had been a calculated move. The Whitakers had feared that the kids had learned too much, that they were getting too close to the truth about the Whitakers' criminal activities. The teenagers had been silenced before they could expose the family's darkest secrets. But Harrow wasn't ready to back down. He refused to let the truth die with the Whitakers. He confronted Caldwell, accusing her of being part of the cover-up. At first, she denied it, but Harrow could see the cracks in her facade, the guilt in her eyes. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "They'll destroy me. They'll destroy all of us if we speak out." "I had no choice." Caldwell's voice wavered, but Harrow wasn't moved. He'd heard enough. The mayor wasn't a victim. She was complicit in everything. She had helped orchestrate the murders, and now she was trying to protect herself. In that moment, Harrow made a decision. He had to stop the Whitakers and everyone who had helped them. He couldn't let this town continue to live under their shadow. He had to expose everything, no matter the peat. Harrow's next move was a risk, one that could cost him everything. He knew the town's power structure wouldn't let him take down the Whitakers without a fight, but he had evidence that could bring the entire operation crumbling down. And Caldwell, despite her fear, was too far gone to help them now. The town of Fairview would never be the same after that night. Harrow had gathered the evidence he needed. Everything from the Whitakers' financial records to the testimony of the few brave souls who had witnessed the family's corrupt dealings. The walls of silence that had held the town captive for years were about to come down. When Harrow presented his findings, the backlash was immediate. The Whitakers, their business empire in shambles, fought tooth and nail to save their reputation. But it was too late. The truth had been exposed, and Fairview was finally free from their grip. But the cost of that truth was high. Several key figures in the town, including Mayor Caldwell, were arrested for their roles in the conspiracy. The Whitaker family faced charges that would forever tarnish their name. But for those who had been silenced for so long, there was finally some justice. As for Detective Clyde Harrow, he had brought down a powerful family and a corrupt system. But it wasn't without its toll. The weight of the truth was heavy, and Harrow knew that the scars of this investigation would last for years to come. Fairview would heal, but it would never forget the darkness that had once plagued it. The town's secrets had been uncovered, and with them, the realization that sometimes the most dangerous crimes are the ones committed in plain sight. And so, the story of the Fairview fast food murders came to a close. But the lessons learned were clear. In a small town, the truth doesn't always stay hidden. Sometimes it takes someone willing to face the darkness to bring it into the light. This case is still unsolved.